All right, very good. We are now going to start the class. So this class is about the month of Tammuz. Every month has certain characteristics. Every month in the Hebrew calendar has certain characteristics, certain ideas. And Tammuz is no exception. And one can understand the nature of the month through understanding the characteristics that are mentioned in the Sefer Yetzirah, and particularly those that the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, basically the father of modern Kabbalah, how he lists them and he works them out and explains them and so on and so forth. These are obviously, there's many levels of explanation and many ways of putting these things together, but nevertheless, we can get some insight into just some of the ways. There have been previous classes that discussed other approaches, other explanations of the month, but I think this particular class will focus on some different things. In any event, the month is called Tammuz. Let me actually share a screen with you here. 1 second. The month is called the month of Tammuz. As you can see, Tammuz. And the names of the months actually were not given in the Torah. You don't find them in the Bible. They're not biblical. The names of the months are not biblical. Some of them are mentioned in the writings of the prophets, but generally the names of the months actually come from Babylon, when after the destruction of the temple in the around the second century, early second century. So the exile to Babylon took place, and it was there that the names of the months were actually given and stuck. Originally in the Torah only refers to the months by number. For example, the month of Nisan, when Passover falls, is called the first month. Iyar is the second month. Sivan, the third month. That's the month in which the Torah was given on Mount Sinai. That's that is called the third month, or Sivan. And Tammuz is the fourth month. Tammuz is the fourth month of the year. The year starts not with creation, but rather with the exodus from Egypt. Now, that in itself is a very interesting thing. Initially, prior to the exodus from Egypt, in other words, in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were not subject to exile per se. They went through exiles in their lives, but they're not subject to a general exile in that sense, a decreed exile. So in their times, the year actually began with the first of the month of Tishrei. The first of the month of Tishrei, which is called the seventh month in the calendar as we now have it. It's the seventh month, but that was the first month. Why? Because it was the month of creation. That was when the world was created, according to tradition. The world was created, all of creation was created in the month of Tishrei, on the day of Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year. Okay, so at the method of counting then, the method of counting the months, that was initially the first month, the month of creation. But after the exodus from Egypt, we began counting the months from the exodus to indicate that there was a whole new paradigm that was now available to us. This paradigm wasn't a paradigm of history per se. In other words, from the creation of the world and everything that happened subsequently and so on and so forth, and going through the cycle of time historically. This was a transcendental experience The exodus from Egypt is a transcendental experience. It happened in a physical sense as well. There was an exodus from Egypt. But the greater exodus was the exodus of the soul from a state of exile. From its state of exile, the possibility, if you want to put it in these terms, the possibility was now given of enlightenment, but not enlightenment the way it was before that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob experienced it, but enlightenment which was completely transcendent, a transcendent enlightenment, if you want to put it in those terms. And therefore, the counting of the months began a whole new procedure. Okay, so each of the months of the year is actually associated with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, but there are only 12 letters which correspond to the months. Those are the letters which are, they have a special grammatical value, which I'm not going to go into the whole thing now because it would take too long to explain. But basically, these are the letters, for those of you who are interested, the letters Hey Vav, Zayin Chet, Tet Yud, Lamed Nun, Samach Ayin, and Tzadi Kuf. Those are the letters that correspond, 12 letters that correspond to the months. These are called the 12 pshutos, right? The 12 simple letters that are not used in other grammatical structures. Okay, so the month of Tammuz, this particular month, gets its name originally. All right, I was going to explain the letters. Let me do that first, and then I'll go to the name of the month. So the corresponding letter of the Hebrew alphabet is the letter Chet. Now, this in itself is interesting because the letter Chet actually begins. Phonically, when you say the word chet in Hebrew, which is that letter, it's pronounced that way, right? The Gat rule. So that letter chet, when you pronounce it that way, it spells out the word. Unfortunately, the word chet, right? The word chet means sin. And this is kind of apropos in the sense that this month was the month in which there was the worship of. It was the month in which the spies brought a bad report about the land of Israel. It's the month of when there was various negative things like idol worship, idolatry, and so on and so forth. So the months of Sivan, Tammuz and Av, this month and the month that follows, have these two letters as their root letters, right? The letter for Tammuz is Chet, and the letter for Av, which is the next month, is Tet, which already is the first three letters of the word Chet. Now, one thing which Kabbalah teaches us, and certainly the Kabbalah of the Baal Shem Tov, is not to dwell on the negative. Yes, there were negative events. There were sinful acts, but we don't dwell in the sin. We dwell in the tikkun. The whole purpose of Kabbalah is to bring about the concept of tikkun. Tikkun meaning rectification. In other words, whatever was negative now has to be transformed into positive. Negative things happened, and that's part of life. Unfortunately, we make the wrong choices sometimes, and for various reasons. Some of it could be selfishness, some of it could be lack of knowledge, some of it could be all kinds of other reasons. And whatever the reasons are that these things happen, that these negative things happen, the response to it is not to go into a state of depression or into a state of sadness and anxiety, but rather into a state of rectification. This is, in fact, our sages tell us that in the future, in the Messianic era, these months, the month of Tammuz and Av, will be the most celebratory months possible. They will be the months of celebration, months of joy. Right now, they're not really like that, but they will be. Now, interestingly enough, the word for depression I'm going to write it here in Hebrew, is atzvut. Oh. That didn't write Hebrew, did it? Atzvut. Atzvut. It's not going in the middle. Oh, okay, here we go. It doesn't need to be bold, and it needs to be smaller. All right, there we go. Atzvut. Atzvut is actually related to the word atzevim, which in Hebrew means idols. One of the words for idols in Hebrew is atzevim. So the whole concept of atzvut, of sadness, of depression, of that complete lack, I shouldn't say complete, but that lack of energy to change one's situation, is really idolatry. That atzvus, depression, is a form of idolatry. It's a form, in a sense, it's a form of self-worship. Or, alternatively, one could explain that it's a worship of things in the past. It's a lack of, what I mean by that, it's a lack of recognition that things could be different in the future. And not that things could be different, but that things will be different in the future. So depression is very backward looking. The truth is that depression is very energetic. People say that the people who are depressed have no energy. It's not true. What is true is that all their energy is in ruminating about the past. You don't find that people who are depressed really look forward to the future at all. They're not looking. They're assuming that what's happening today and what happened yesterday is going to happen tomorrow, and it's going to continue in this way. So that their depression may be forward-looking in the sense that they believe that things will continue the way they are now. But that itself is idolatry, because there's a God in the world, and we know, and God can change things automatically. The future is not dictated by the past. It may be guided by the past, but it's not dictated by the past per se. In any event, the interesting thing about this word atzevim, idolatry, is that the word Tammuz itself, here, this word, the name of the month, is actually related, and this is mentioned in one of the prophets, I believe it's in Ezekiel, in Yechezkel, as one of the idolatries of the Babylonians. It was one of their idols, was called the Tammuz. And the verse says, "Vahanashim mevakois es haTammuz." They were crying, they were weeping about the Tammuz. Again, this reminiscence of the concept of atzvut, of sadness. So the month of Tammuz, if we don't take it in the right way, could be construed as a month of sadness, a month of negativity, a month of depression. It doesn't have to be that way, even though there were negative events that happened in this month. Okay. Again, the beginning of the destruction of the temple happened in this month as well. There were all kinds of negative things that happened, but it doesn't have to be. That doesn't have to be the focus. The focus has to be on the tikkun, on the rectification. So therefore, again, we said that we discussed the 8th letter. This all comes from the Sefer Yetzirah, by the way. All these things come from the Sefer Yetzirah. I'll explain them a little bit more. Okay. Every month represents a certain channel. What are the channels between the Sfirot? As everybody knows, the Sfirot, I should actually have this up on my screen, but I don't. As usual, I forget to do these things. Let's see here. Let me see. Yeah, here we go. Okay. Let me move it over to where you can see it. Make it a bit bigger so you can see it a bit better. Okay. Okay. I know it's probably obscuring some of it. Right, these are the some of the Sefirot. Chochmah, Bina, Dat. Above that is Keter, but I won't show you that right now. There's Keter, but for our purposes right now, it's not that relevant. Well, I can show you here. These here are called the channels between the Sefirot. In other words, these channels are the means by which each Sefirah influences the ones below it or connected to it or whatever. So there's a channel over here. There's a channel over here. There's a channel between Chochmah and Gvura, between Bina and Chesed, channel between Chochmah and Bina over here, between Dat and Tiferet, and so on and so forth, right? As you can see. So the channel that we're talking about from this particular month is the channel from Chesed, which represents love and kindness, to the channel of Tiferet, which is the concept in Hebrew of the concept of beauty. Right, the concept of beauty or glory in the soul, it represents the power of compassion, the idea of compassion. So loving kindness and compassion are connected by the channel. Now you can see why this whole concept of Tammuz is not necessarily a negative thing in and of itself. Why? Because it represents this incredibly important channel from kindness to compassion. So if it's that channel, if it represents that channel, then we can be sure that the nature thereof is not a nature, is not one of harshness or negativity. The Sefirah, which represents harsh attributes and so on, is the Sefirah of Gvura. Why does it keep on doing that? Is the Sefirah of Gvura. That's what represents harshness. Gvura is sometimes called din, judgment, severities. But the channel from Chesed to Tiferet represents really the opposite of that, completely the opposite of that. So, again, the nature of the month, even though historically it has negative qualities, in reality, underneath the negative qualities lies the idea of the arousal of the flow from Chesed to Tiferet. Okay, I'm going to put this all together soon. The next thing we look at is the chush. Chush means the sense. You know, you have your 5 senses. Well, in Kabbalah, there's actually 12 senses. The sense that is associated with the month of Tammuz is the sense of sight. It's the sense of sight. Now, why is this important? We'll see shortly. Ruvain is the tribe. Each one of the months is associated with a tribe as well. There were 12 tribes at 12 months. Each tribe has a month, so to speak. The tribe of this month is the tribe of Reuven, or Reuben as it's pronounced in, I suppose, in English, right? So Reuben was actually the firstborn, he was Jacob's firstborn, and therefore had a very important part to play in the family hierarchy, let's put it that way. As the first child, the firstborn child, he had a very important role to play in the family hierarchy. He messed up in a number of different ways, and therefore the role was actually given over to, the role of the firstborn was actually given over to the third son named Levi. But in any event, why was he called Reuven? Because his mother, Leah, said, Ru'u, Ben, right? See, you could read it as, see my son. Or, see the difference between my son and my husband's brother. see the difference between my son and my husband's brother. He's her husband's brother. Her husband was Jacob. Leah's husband was Jacob, Yaakov. And her son, his brother, Jacob's brother, was Esau. So, Ru'u ma ben beni leven acherim. Yeah, look at the difference between my son and the and that other son, referring to Esau. Okay, but the word here is Ru'u, to see. So we see that this fits perfectly. Now, what's the difference between seeing something, let's say, and hearing something? Well, when you hear something, you really hear it, in a sense, secondhand. The sound that something makes is a result of whatever is happening with that particular thing, but it's not the thing itself. When you see something, you see the thing itself. That is very significant, because the idea of the month of Tammuz is essentially to be able to come to see the right things. What does it mean to see the right things? To see the right things means to look with a good eye. There's an expression in a Talmudic expression. It's actually from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, in the Ethics of the Fathers. There was one of the great Talmudic sages sent out his students to see what was the most desirable thing, the most desirable characteristic of a human being. What's the most desirable characteristic of a human being? One of them said, Ayin Tov, right? A good eye. What does a good eye mean? It means an eye that sees the good. That's what it means. It doesn't mean that you have good eyesight necessarily. It means the eye that sees the good in things, right? What is the good in things that let me just see, there's a question in the chat. Named after the Babylonian sun god, could be, yeah, right. Tammuz, yeah. A good eye is one of the characteristics that particular sage saw as being the most important positive character trait that a person can and should cultivate. A good eye, to see the good in everything, not only the good in other people, but the good in all situations. In other words, to understand that buried under negative events, there is ultimately some good that can be taken out of it, that can be retrieved from that negative thing. In fact, the more negative it is, probably the greater the good that can be dredged forth from that idea. So the idea of Re'iyah then is to see the good in all things. And that's why Reuven, initially, that was the sort of the blessing that he got from his mother when she gave him his name, was to be able to see the good, right? Not only to discern the good, but to be able to understand the good from the bad. Right? Ma ben beni levein acherim, right? What's the difference between my son? To be able to see the difference between good and evil doesn't mean there's no evil. There is evil in the world. There's no question about it that there is evil. But to be able to see the good even in situations where one doesn't initially see the good therein. Now, does this mean, obviously there's going to be a question, does this mean Ernest is asking, is seeing the good related to elevating sparks in our time? That's exactly what it's related to. That's exactly what it is, because let me just explain that nothing can exist in the world, nothing could exist, no event could take place unless there was some divine spark hidden within it. Now, does it mean, therefore, that a completely wicked person, an absolutely wicked person, let's say Stalin, Hitler, people like that, does it mean that we should look for the good in them? Not in people like that, no. But the situation into which they put us, into which they put people, nevertheless has something that can be brought out of it that can be beneficial and can be good. Even if the lesson is what not to be. To distinguish between what, like Ruvain, Ru'ubaim Beni, see the difference between my son and others. In other words, see the goodness, that some people are good and some people are evil. That also is the concept of sight, and it's looking for the good in things, not looking for the bad. Yes, if only bad presents itself, then we have to keep away from it. There's no question about it. But when there's good that we can see in something, then we can bring it closer. We can lift it up. We can elevate it, as Ernest pointed out, elevating the sparks. Okay. The what's it called of this month, the Mazal in Hebrew, the constellation. What's it called again in English? I forget what it's called. Anyway, it's Cancer, right? Sartan, the crab, is the Mazal of this month. What's it called again? I mean, someone should know it here in English. In astrology, yeah, right. The astrological sign, of the month is called Cancer or Sartan, right? Now, this in itself is also has obviously negative connotations because, as we all know, that is one of the most serious diseases, and obviously, when a person gets it, God forbid, if a person gets it, let's put it that way, it's going to mean a royal struggle to overcome it, and probably a lot of pain and suffering will go along with it. However, if you meet people who have actually managed to vanquish that disease, to overcome it, they have a certain strength most people do, that is admirable. We don't know why people have challenges. There's all kinds of reasons why people have challenges. I'll tell you a little story. I think I mentioned this maybe a week ago. But it's a beautiful little story about the Baal Shem Tov. There was a person who was a very great scholar, and unfortunately he suffered tremendously. He was poverty-stricken, and nothing he did seemed to help. And he suffered from health issues and all kinds of other issues. And he lived in the same city as the same town, really, as the Baal Shem Tov. And it was his wife that recommended that he go and see the Baal Shem Tov. He wasn't a follower of the Baal Shem Tov, but she recommended, why don't you go? He helps many, many people. Maybe he'll be able to help you as well. So he agreed eventually, and he went to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov said you have to go to a certain city, like far away, and over there you have to look for a person of a certain name, and from this you will know why and what to do about your situation. In any event, he went to this town. I told this story, I think, last week or the week before. He went to this town. And the town was called Kozhenitz. He went to the town and he asked for that person. He says, no such person who lives in this town. There used to be somebody 60 years ago, but he passed away, and he was a terrible person, an absolutely wicked person. There was nothing in the book that he didn't do wrong, right? He did everything he shouldn't have done. And therefore, he died in 60 years ago. Doesn't live here. There's no one in the town of that name. Anyway, it goes back to the Baal Shem Tov, this man, this scholar, this great scholar. He goes back to the Baal Shem Tov and he tells the Baal Shem Tov, the place that you sent me to, there was no such person. There was a person by that name, but he died 60 years ago, and he was a very wicked person, and so on. And he told the whole story. And the Baal Shem Tov said to him, well, you were that person. Now do you understand what it is that you have to do? And anyway, the Baal Shem Tov gave him a tikkun. He gave him a way of rectifying that, and he became, needless to say, a student of the Baal Shem Tov, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, a great disciple of the Baal Shem Tov. So we see that, sometimes we go through circumstances and difficulties and so on. We don't understand why we have them, but there's reasons for that we have them. It's not just because the universe is evil and it's ganging up on you, or God is ganging up on you, or something like that, or wants to punish you. There's no such thing as punishment without rectification. In fact, punishment is a very iffy word in Hebrew and in Kabbalah in particular. We don't like to use the word punishment. We just like to use the word rectification, because that's really what it is. If a person is going through difficulties and suffering and so on and so forth, there's reasons for it. We don't know what the reasons are, but the attitude to take is, this is part of my tikkun, it's part of my rectification, and I'm already looking forward to the next step when I will be rectified and I won't have to go through this anymore. Okay. Now, every month in the Hebrew calendar is also associated with the 12 permutations of the ineffable name. I will write the name down over here. All right, that's the ineffable name. In other words, the name which we don't pronounce, we don't say it out loud, we don't say it the way it really is, because it is forbidden to use the divine names without, if not in prayer or in study. In any event, this name. If I didn't tell that story before, by the way, I teach a number of different classes, private classes, and so on and so forth, and in synagogues and so on. So it could be that I didn't tell the story. I don't know. I think I did, but if I didn't, that was the story before that I mentioned before. If I didn't tell it, so there you have it. So. Every month there are 12 possible permutations of this of the name of this divine ineffable. Why only 12 permutations? There should be actually 24 permutations, but you have 2 letters that are the same, and therefore you only have 12 permutations. You love hearing stories. Okay, the truth is I should tell more stories. We should analyze some stories in future classes. We will do that, God willing. So anyway, the permutation of this particular month is exactly the opposite of the proper permutation, right? This permutation is the proper permutation, but the permutation for this month is exactly the opposite. It is Hey, Vav, Hey, Yud, right? It's backwards. It's exactly backwards, which tells you something about the month. This is the month of backward. It's a month of backwardness. It's the month where things are set up in such a way that they don't work ideally in the proper way, right? It's the month which has to be switched around to positive permutations. Nevertheless, there is an advantage. There's an advantage in this permutation. The regular permutation, which is Yud, Hey, and Vav, and Hey, that permutation starts at the top. The letter Yud represents Chochmah. The letter Hey represents Bina. The letter Vav represents the 6 Sfirot, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. And the final Hey represents Malchut. If I could just bring this up again. So I will show you again. The Yud represents Chochmah. That's Sfira. Hey, Bina. Vav represents these 6 Sfirot, and particularly the Sfira of Tiferet, but all the 6 Sfirot, and that's why Vav is the numerical value of 6. And the final Hey represents Malchut. Right? Represents Malchut. So, the direction of the name when it is in the proper permutation, Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, when it's in that permutation, then it represents the flow from above to below, from Chochmah to Bina to the 6 midot called Zer Anpin and Malchut. That's the proper way that the flow comes from above to below. However, This here represents exactly the opposite. It represents the order of Malchut. Then the six Sfirot are from Yesod to Chesed, going from below to above. Then Bina, and then Chochmah. In other words, it represents the climb upwards. That's what it represents. It represents the idea of the movement from below to above. If this represents the movement or the flow from above to below, this represents exactly the opposite, the movement from below to above, which is exactly the point of our being created in this world, that we'll move from our situation to the top, to the Yud, to the highest possible aspect that we can reach. Now, all of this, this name, the permutation of the name, is found in the end letters of this verse from Esther. It's Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, is tells about the story of. I guess everybody knows the story about an evil minister named Haman, who basically wished to destroy the entire Jewish people, and a lot of it had to do with the fact of his hatred for the leader of the Jewish people at that time, whose name was Mordechai. And Esther was Mordechai's niece. He brought her up because her parents, she was an orphan at a very young age, and he brought her up. And Esther was had gotten married to the king, to the emperor, to whom Haman was the second in command. He was the vizier or viceroy, whatever you call him. Yeah, the second in line, the second most powerful person in the kingdom of Shushan, in the city of Shushan, and the kingdom of Ahasuerus, which he was a world emperor at that time. All the known world he controlled. So Haman wanted to destroy Mordechai. And one of the verses, this verse in chapter 5, verse 13 of the scroll of Esther, in the story, which tells the story of this whole story. So one of the verses says is Haman thinking to himself, or actually he's thinking to himself and talking to his wife. He says that everybody, when he goes in the streets, everybody bows down to him. Everybody was bowing down to him because he was the second in command, and he demanded that people bow down to him. He demanded it. But the one person that wouldn't bow down to him was Mordechai. And he says to his wife, he thinks to himself, and he says to his wife, "V'chol zeh eneno shaveli, v'chol zeh eneno." All of this is not worth it for me. The fact that everybody else bows down to me is not sufficient. It's not worth it. Why not? When I see Mordechai sitting in the king's gate, he was one of the king's advisors, so it's called he was sitting in the king's gate, and he won't bow down to me. He refuses to bow down. Now these words, "V'chol zeh enenu shaveli," it's not worth it for me. That's the permutation of this month. It's not worth it for me. In other words, what characteristic does this portray? Enenu shavel, it's not worth it for me. It's not enough. It's insufficient. It portrays the concept of jealousy and a complete lack of gratitude. It's jealousy and gratitude and ingratitude rolled into one. However much a person has is not good enough. He was an extremely wealthy man. In fact, in order to destroy the Jewish people, which he decided he was going to destroy the entire Jewish people, primarily because of Mordechai, he was going to destroy all of them. So when the king sort of bolted it and he didn't want it to happen, so Haman said, "Don't worry, I will give you their worth in gold, or in gold and silver, whatever it was. I will give you their worth. He had found there were three treasures which had been hidden by Joseph. Joseph buried treasure in three different places. One of them was found by Korach, which is the story in this week's Torah reading. Korach found one of them, and he got very, very wealthy, and therefore he became very arrogant. Another one was found by Haman. That is what our sages tell us. He found one of those buried treasures, and that's how he became so wealthy. And the third one we'll get in the future. Will be found in the future. Okay, so he said it's not worth it for me. Whatever I have is not enough. Right? The fact that he was extremely wealthy, the fact that everyone was bowing down to him, the fact that he had as much honor as he could possibly want was not enough, because it wasn't everybody that honored him. It was one person that didn't honor him, it was not enough for him. So again, we were talking about this whole concept of looking at things in the wrong way, with a bad eye. What he saw was the negative. He didn't see that he had all the glory in the world, basically, except maybe some people didn't approve of him for one reason or another. No, he looked at the only thing that bothered him was that there's one person who doesn't bow down to me. There's one person who doesn't regard me as a supreme being, the supreme, the second in command to the supreme leader of this nation, and so on. So that idea is the negative side of Tammuz that we have to overcome. That's the negative aspect of all of these things, which, in other words, we have to teach ourselves to look at the good in all things. Now, it may not be so easy always to look at the good in everything. It may not be so easy, but nevertheless, that is what is essentially required. We have to turn all that, kol zeh eneno shoveli, all of this is not worth it for me, and we have to turn it on its head, and we have to say, all of this that happens is indeed worth it for me, because it leads me to a greater place. Yes, it's true that we experience difficulties and suffering, perhaps, in this world, but that's the nature of the world. It's okay, because it's a tikkun. It's going to lead eventually to the right things, and even if we don't see it in this lifetime, nevertheless, in the afterlife, it could be that everything was purified, and therefore one doesn't have to go through the difficulties of what happens in the next stage of life. Let's put it that way. There's life after life, as we've spoken about before. So that is the month of that is the month of Tammuz. The month of Tammuz is a month in which we have to turn everything around. It's a month of turning things around from negative permutations to positive permutations, and to look at things, to learn to look at things in the right way, with a good eye. Okay, that's about it. Any questions?